Hey everybody, this is Texas State Representative Trey Martinez Fischer, and you're listening to Politex, your place for all things Texas, all things politics. We're going to have a great pod today. This week is our budget week. The House will be taking up the Senate Bill 1, which is going to be the budget for the next 2 years. It's a $251 billion budget, and we cannot get into every single dollar in one podcast, but I've got some great helpers today. Join me on the show is going to be none other than San Antonio's Texas State Representative Ina Minjarez, who serves on the Appropriations Committee. We always tease her that she's the one carrying the checkbook. And then we also have, as an additional guest, Ursula Parks. She is the former executive director of our legislative budget board. So she's the one that makes sure that the money goes where we say it's going to go. And she has to account for every dollar in, every dollar out. And she will be joining us today, and we're going to talk about the budget. We look forward to it. Hey, thank you for listening. We are growing. Our engagements are getting crazy, all because of you. And so continue to listen, spread the word, and don't forget to follow me on social media, on both Facebook and on Twitter at TMFTX. And then again, that is at TMFTX. Thank you for supporting Politex. Thank you for listening. If you have a suggestion for the show or an idea for a potential episode, I value your feedback. Email your suggestions to contact@TreyMartinezFisher.com. As always, thank you for listening to Politics. Okay, we're back. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about the state budget, which is pretty exciting. It's also pretty dense. There's no way we can get through it in one podcast. We're talking about $251 billion, but I brought some help. We have some wonderful guests. You certainly know her as being one of San Antonio's best fighters in the Texas legislature. And that is Representative Ina Minjarez, who I'm proud to serve with, and I've known for a while. Matter of fact, I tell people we met when she was a baby prosecutor and I was a baby criminal defense lawyer at the courthouse, and we managed to be friends back then, and now we serve together, so it really helps. So, Ina, welcome to the show. And we're also fortunate to have somebody who I call the font of knowledge when it comes to all things budget in the state of Texas. Her name is Ursula Parks. You may not recognize her. You're not supposed to, because she is rarely seen, but she is the person behind the curtain as the former executive director of the Legislative Budget Board, which is really the place where you see us on the floor fighting and arguing and moving money around. Well, at the end of the day, somebody has to count that money, and at the end of the day, somebody has to send that money in accordance with the instructions that we set in this budget, and that would be Ursula Parks. So, Ursula, thank you for joining both of us. Ina, just give us a couple of minutes. You're a 4 a.m. riser, and you need to be on the Appropriations Committee. Just give us a couple of minutes of background about, what you've been doing these last, 3 months.
Well, the Appropriations Committee, I believe, is probably the biggest committee of the House. I always take pride, and I say that we're the hardest working committee of the House. But there's so many of us. There's so much need in Texas. We got to figure out how to balance the budget. The Constitution holds that the legislature, the one bill that we have to pass is that budget. And so we start early before all the other committees. We start meeting pretty early, probably right after committee assignments come out. And then we're broken up into subgroups. So I serve on Article 3, which is dedicated towards funding public education and higher ed. And then I was put on another new subcommittee that is dealing with strategic fiscal review and federal funding. But essentially what it is just crunching numbers, trying to see what money we have, questioning why we have the money that we do, what happened to the money that we don't have, what we're used to. For example, oil and gas didn't do so well, so we took a hit there. And then just working on trying to work on a budget. This year, the Senate took the lead. So every other session, the House or the Senate takes the lead. The Senate drew up their version of the budget and said, here, House, this is what we have, and we love our budget. And essentially, we don't necessarily agree on everything. So we do our recommendations, and then I believe on the 22nd, we're going to decide what we think of the budget. And it gives the opportunity for the entire House, the entire body, to vote and put in their amendments and have a say on the budget.
All right. Well, I failed to set that up properly. Thank you for reminding us. I mean, we came off just a horrible 2020. Our economy just pretty much not only stopped, in many instances, it reversed. I mean, sales tax was down. Alcohol taxes were down with restaurants and bars closed. hotel occupancy tax down. At one point, the cost of oil was negative $30, which meant when you gave somebody your oil, you gave them $30 to go along with it. And so we were in really sad state. We thought this budget was going to fall apart. And so Ursula, you've been in a lot of hot budgets in your career, and you're still doing it now, in your new work. But just kind of let our readers and let our listeners and viewers know about where this budget sort of how it was set up, in terms of what you've dealt with historically, and sort of give us your perspective on where we are right now.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today, talking about my favorite thing, state budget and fiscal policy, which I have been doing for a very long time. I've been working in this area for over 25 years as the nonpartisan leader of the Legislative Budget Board, and now as a consultant, still working in this area. And it sounds kind of trite now because everybody is saying it, but obviously we've been through an absolutely unprecedented period. Nobody has any experience going through exactly what everybody's been through over the last year and a half. Facing a global pandemic, the economic ramifications of that, the personal, the human ramifications of it, and all of that is playing into how the state budget is getting formulated right now for a variety of reasons. One, state revenue is looking a little different than it did 2 years or 4 years ago. We've never had the kind of immediate, precipitous economic contraction that we saw associated with the economic response to the pandemic. We've never seen the kind of unemployment numbers that we saw. And that has a ramification in the state treasury in terms of the revenues we collect, as was stated. It also has a very human consequence in terms of how families are operating, how businesses are operating, and all of that ripples through the state budget process. Probably the closest session to this that anybody could remember were the kind of sessions we were facing in 2009 and in 2011. You can go back a little further, 2003 was also very difficult. Those sessions were a reflection of an economic contraction, a recession, and then also, similar to right now, a key feature in 2009 and in 2011 was a significant amount of federal stimulus funding, which is also the case right now. So this budget really initially had to get developed and formed when the folks who do that work were waiting to see what the numbers would really look like and what revenue would really look like. And that became a little bit more clear in January of this year when Controller Hager gave us a revenue estimate that was actually a little better than a lot of folks expected it would be. Apparently folks are resilient and Texans are resilient and have managed to weather the economic contraction from a state revenue perspective a little bit better than many of us expected would be the case.
Right.
It doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of needs out there, though.
No.
Just because there's money in the treasury doesn't mean that businesses are thriving the way we would like for them to, or that families and individuals are thriving the way we would like for them to.
Right. No, thank you. And I was wanting to jump in because I get so passionate about the budget, as does Ina. But I think it's also fair, and maybe from my perspective, that sometimes our budget can be stingy, right? And so when you're resilient and trying to bounce back and put a budget together, a bare bones budget may cost less than a budget that might have all the things that I'd like to see, or all the things that Representative Hodges would like to see. But you're right. Texans in general are resilient, and we are half full, not half empty. But we go home every session, and we spend more time explaining the things that we didn't get to do. And so, look, I rarely challenge Ina, because if I told her no one knows, what's in a $251 billion budget, she's going to pull out her pad and prove me wrong. So we're not going to get into that. But does anybody want to just touch on some of the budget highlights of the 251? What are we proud of? Did we make any new investments in areas, or what can folks, we're going to debate this on Thursday, but as we go into budget week, what do we see in the House budget that's come out of committee?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to talk about is Ursula did a great job talking about the unprecedented times that we were facing. As a result of that, leadership, the governor had a directive that there needed to be 5% cuts across the board with our state agencies, with our public universities, and et cetera. And so Those cuts were done, they were mandated. And essentially now when we came back into session, I think unfortunately there were some real critical programs that took that cut. One in particular that everyone's very familiar with, Communities in School, was one of them. And they're so important and critically important to our kiddos. And I think one of the things in Article 3 that we tried to do was, how can we restore some of those cuts? I think one of the few things that I was happy about, because I feel that there was so much more to be done, was we were able to restore that 5% cut back to Communities in School. We were able to ensure that grants for college and financial aid was continued on the state level. So there were definitely some wins, but I think unfortunately, when we're looking at new money and wanting to fund new things that I think we all feel that is critical to each representative from the districts that we represent, we were basically told we got to hold off because we don't know how that federal money, it may apply there, but the federal money is not here yet, especially for our schools.
Okay, well, that's a good point. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, Ursula, I mean, is there anything that stands out in this budget in terms of, watching this money get allocated in its current shape?
Sure. There's a couple things I'd note. One is that, again, back in January, when the appropriations bill was first introduced, and so the first working document, that the appropriations and finance committees had to work with, those budgets were all out of balance by about $7 billion. That meant that they were spending $7 billion more than the Controller of Public Accounts said we were going to have in the Treasury. That's an obvious problem on the face of it. It's also, it's a particular problem for Texas because we have a constitutional provision that essentially says Texas cannot deficit spend. We can only spend as much as the Controller says will be in the Treasury. That is a very fiscally conservative thing to do. And it does kind of keep our budget in check. It keeps things from, it keeps us from having the kind of debt load that we see in some other states and certainly that we see nationally. So one of the first things that the Appropriations Committee had to figure out how to do was how to dig out of that $7 billion hole. That was job one. And they did. They did that largely by making some adjustments to spending that's happening right now in 2021. Some of that had to do with using some federal money instead of state general revenue, some other adjustments, including these reductions that were just mentioned, these 5% reductions to agencies, and then some reductions for 22-23. So for example, the Medicaid program, which very interestingly is not currently running a shortfall, which was a huge help in balancing the budget, was not having a Medicaid shortfall this year. Very unusual not to have that. We don't have a shortfall, and the appropriators did reduce the total appropriation for Medicaid by a couple $2 billion for 22-23. That was in part, to get the budget back inside the rails. I'll say the foundation school program is fully funded. So the entitlements for school districts, including all of the investments that y'all made 2 years ago in House Bill 3, those are funded in this bill. And there are some investments in infrastructure and capital that were also made in the House bill, which is a very, again, kind of a forward-thinking investment budgeting, kind of thing to do. So those are a couple things that I'd point out.
Those are good. Those are significant, and I think what you mean, in terms of the Medicaid shortfall is typically in most budgets that I'm familiar with, Nina as well, is it can fall short as much as $1 billion in a budget cycle. So in other words, when we come back to Austin to write the next budget, we have an IOU of about $1 billion to the current budget, and we didn't have that in this instance. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. I mean, early estimates were actually pushing that number to close to $2 billion for what the shortfall could be. And that's gone in large part due to federal action that is letting us draw down more federal money for Medicaid right now than was initially estimated.
Perfect. So just like we can't talk about a $251 billion budget in 28-minute podcast, we definitely can't get into the whys and the why nots and the politics of the refusal to expand Medicaid, which, we'll probably do a separate pod on that one day. But you all are budget appropriators, at heart. I just can't ever find another legislative deal that, costs me $1 and I get $9 back. And that's just, that's my political commentary on healthcare. And, we just, it saddens me to know that we have so much need and we have the resources there to make it happen. And so that made me just sort of tease it up for our next segment, which is, okay, so we know what's in the budget. We know, kind of Texans bounce back, and we have a budget that's going to, meet, essential needs. But what's not in the budget? And I have, appropriations, deja vu. You mentioned the budget of 2009. And for those of you that remember 2009, we had a Hurricane Ike. We had a brand new president in the White House, and President Barack Obama and Vice President Biden. And we also had an economy, not just Texas, the entire country was really suffering from a significant economic catastrophe. And one of the first things, the administration did was they passed a stimulus bill, and a lot of money came to Texas. And so, Ursula, if I remember correctly, when that happened, federal dollars were immediately used to help us with our budget. And fast forwarding to right now, is it the same kind of scenario? We are sitting by my count, you all are the appropriators, but my count is we have about $18 billion for schools. And we have about $16 billion that was given to the state from the federal government for state needs. What is the status of that money? And if you can tell me, and then we'll get Ina's perspective.
So I'll start on that. So in 2009, as you said, the country was in recession. We were, Texas was a little slow coming into the recession and was then slow coming out of it on both sides of that. And the federal government gave Texas about, I think the final tally was maybe $8 billion to help us weather that storm. And some of that was used just to shore up shortfalls that we were having. And some of it was used to, spend in the subsequent biennium to support programs that there wasn't enough GR, to support. Fast forward to now, and that $8 billion is kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of federal funding that both the Trump and Biden administrations have made available to states to weather the current crisis. And some of the funding that we got about a year ago has been expended. And a lot of that is how we managed to kind of shore up the current biennium, why we're not in a bigger hole than we otherwise could have been. There was some additional money that came available in December for public education, about $5.5 billion came available in December. And then Congress passed what I kind of think of as sort of the third big tranche of funding last month, just in March, and made another $12 billion available for public education. And as you mentioned, another really significant slug of money to state and local governments to help them get out of this crisis. As of right now, as of the bills that have moved so far in the Senate and the House, that sort of second December tranche of money and that third tranche that just came last month, neither of those are reflected in the appropriations bills as they stand right now.
Okay, and so turning to you, you're the one with a checkbook. I mean, what's the conversation about federal funds? And I know you've been working hard on the committee. Give us a little bit of behind the scenes of what's going on.
So we have a number of public hearings, and we brought forth TEA Commissioner Morath. We had someone from the governor's office, and the constant questions we would ask is, okay, we know these pots of money are coming. Where is it? And we were constantly told again and again, well, we need guidance. We need to make sure we're in compliance with how the feds want us to spend this money. Because if we don't spend it according to how they want us to spend it, Texas will get penalized. And so the constant answer given was, we're waiting for guidance from Treasury. We've submitted it. And then the next question was, well, what guidance do you need? Well, we need more clarification on a term of art called maintenance of effort. And I think maybe Ursula will be better to kind of talk about maintenance of effort. But essentially it comes down to this. They're saying that we want this guidance and kind of saying, until we get this guidance, we can't get the money. Meanwhile, I have superintendents in San Antonio saying, we're in a really bad position. We can't plan for the future. We have a learning gap we need to address. We're having to pull money from our reserves, and that reserve is getting really low. And by law, they can't go below a certain threshold in those reserves. And that's what I'm hearing from superintendents all across Texas. That's a unified call to action. And so that's the frustration is, well, we've asked for guidance. What point do you start taking initiative and demanding an answer? And my fear is once we leave in May, at the end of May, and session is done, well, we don't have a say as representatives, as legislators on this money. So does that fall into the hands of leadership only?
Whoa.
That's where we're at.
That's a really good point. And you know, we don't have to get into the weeds of maintenance and effort, but essentially we have a bunch of money that's been given to us by the federal government. State has not chosen to spend it. And what I mean by that, the leaders in charge, the governor's office, the chairman of House Appropriations, the chairwoman of Senate Finance, lieutenant governor, all folks that are maybe in, you know, one particular party different than ours. But what I don't understand, you know, while Texas is waiting for guidance, I mean, like 40 or 41 states across the country have already began appropriating this money, because obviously we wouldn't be getting it if we didn't need it. And so, but you hit a really good point. You know, I didn't even think about this. I mean, I still have, you know, the bad dreams from 2020 in the middle of a COVID pandemic. We're afraid to even go to the grocery store. And yet we couldn't make any public policy decisions. And all these decisions were sort of bottled up in the executive authority of the governor's office. And we all, Republicans, Democrats, big cities, small farms, lawmakers all over the state said, we're not going to be dealing with this. We represent people that want answers and deserve to have answers. You know, we clearly can't have a policy where the people's money is not being utilized when they need it the most, which is right now. And then moreover, that if we don't spend it, put it in the hands of somebody else who will spend it maybe differently than you and I would spend it if we had a chance to debate it. Is that what you're talking about?
That's what it sounds like. And at what point does the public not have input? Right? At least that we're the voice of the public. They elect us to represent them. Yeah. And so it sounds to me the public gets cut out when the legislators get cut out.
Well, you know, and you know very well, and you know, we can just look in the history books and read the newspapers. I mean, when money was being administered over the COVID pandemic in our off season, right, in 2020, you know, there were conditions that were imposed on schools, or we're going to give you some money for schools, but everybody has to be in the classroom. We're going to give you some money for schools, but you have to take the STAR test. I mean, you know, making laws and spending money at the same time, which is our job. It's my job. It's your job. Yeah, I'd have a hard time shopping at HEB if the folks in the grocery store knew that we have about $34 billion sitting in the bank and we're not spent it. And so, you know, I think people on this pod listening or watching, I mean, yeah, it is a call to action to call your state rep. What can we do? You know, I mean, for people listening, I mean, what any advice on what you tell them to have their members from, because this is a statewide program, how they would engage on this?
I mean, they've got to put the pressure on their local representatives, on their senators, calling the governor's office. It's been interesting when I've spoken to my superintendents, when I've spoken to teacher groups, I've told them, I need you to keep the pressure on. If the pressure's not there, they're not going to feel it. And so I need them to continue being loud. We had Raise Your Hand Texas step in and be loud. We had, HEB stepped in and he wrote a letter, right, to the governor saying, look, do the right thing with this federal money. And so it takes constant pressure, and it also puts them on notice that we're not going to just move on to the next issue tomorrow and forget about this. Right. This is front and center. This is important. This is for our students. These are for our kids. And we're not going to let up.
Good. Well, no, thank you for reminding me that letter from Charles Butt sitting on my desk. He's kind of like E.F. Hutton, when he says something, we all pay attention. And
we all pay attention.
We all pay attention. So, look, we have about 2 minutes, and Ursula, just help me understand. I remember in 2009, we couldn't spend rainy day money for Hurricane Ike to restore Galveston. I think it was a $900 million cost to help make some repairs to state facilities in Galveston. We couldn't use rainy day fund, and ultimately, stimulus dollars from the Obama administration paid for that. That is different than what we're talking about now, is what it sounds like to me. Do you concur based on what Ina was just explaining to me?
Yeah, so right now the mechanics of what are happening is a little different than happened in 2009. You make a good point about the use of the Economic Stabilization Fund in 2009. That was kind of taken off the table in that year. That actually, the House bill that's going to be on the floor next week, those bills do include some Economic Stabilization Fund appropriations. So that's one shift from 2009. But in terms of the federal money in 2009, all of that was appropriated. It was like laid out in the appropriations bill in its own article. So the appropriations bill is divided by subject area, into articles like chapters of a book. And there was a standalone chapter that kind of held, it was called ARA money then, that held that money and kind of laid out where it would go. There is a mechanism in the current bill that essentially says if the state gets more federal money, that money is appropriated.
Perfect.
So there is a mechanism writ large for that money to flow whenever it does come into the state treasury, which, as I understand it, that hasn't happened yet. But the legislature does have, under the Constitution, the right and the responsibility to appropriate funds. That is specifically delegated to the legislative branch in the state constitution.
Well,
so that is a prerogative that the body can choose to exercise however it sees fit.
Well, look, I was going to tell you that is the Texas Constitution that I know and am familiar with, and it's Ina and I are the elected leaders. We're the ones making the decisions, and it's the legislature that has the purse to give to the executive to spend the way we would like for it to be spent. So look, we're going to leave it there because we're running out of time. But look, this is very cool for me. I've done like 6 pods now, and a couple of them are tough to get through. This was fun, and I could do another 30 minutes. And so I appreciate.
Ursula's so good at what she does, and she explains it so simply, or you can get it.
Yes.
That's very kind. Thank you.
And for everybody listening and watching, the budget will take place on Thursday. So you've heard from Representative Minjarez, engage your lawmaker, let them know that it's the people's money and it should be spent by the people's house and in the Texas Senate. And so, with that, we're going to be out of time. Ursula Parks, thank you very, very much. Representative Ina Minjarez, my county mate, thank you. Y'all have a wonderful week. Okay, we'll talk soon. Okay, everybody, that's about all the time we have. You are now budget experts. I want to thank my special guest, Representative Ina Minjarez, my homegirl from San Antonio, and Ursula Parks, from the former director of the Legislative Budget Board. You all have a great week, and we'll see you once again next week on Politex.